all mental illness ultimately has to do with a shortfall of love. Everybody's in an institution, everybody who's struggling with their mental health, etc. It can all be traced very crudely with a marker pen to incidents in childhood when there was a deficiency of love. Love literally helps to heal the mind. All those maneuvers of mind that we associate with health are essentially the gifts of love. Thank you. Thank you very much. In saying that love is more than magic, what we're really hinting at is the idea that it's a subject which enters philosophy. It is a subject on which we can reflect logically. But a little caveat here. We might think, well, what is the person? What is the nature of the person who has reflected logically on love? What is their life likely to be like? And I'm going to put up my hand here and argue for a certain way of living. I think the expert on love should have what other people think of as a bad love life, a difficult love life, a complicated love life. There's a lovely bit in Marcel Proust where he says that if a sick man is looking for a doctor, you should always look for a doctor who's very well acquainted with illness. Only illness itself will force the doctor to explore the nature of unwellness at the level of depth which it deserves. And something similar applies to love. So if you're looking for an expert on love, you found him not because he understands and has led a flawless life, but because he's pretty much made every single error in the book, and this has therefore incentivized him to look more deeply. So the place in which we find ourselves now in relation to love has a history. Love has a history, and we need to become historians of love if we are to try and understand it. It's a subject that shifts in time. We have not always loved as we love now, and so it's really important to situate ourselves a little bit. And of course, we are still broadly living in the Romantic era. I know we don't think of that in necessarily in those terms in all areas, but broadly speaking, the Romantic age kicks off Germany, France, the UK in the late 18th century, and really the 19th century is the heyday of it. And it's connected up with the decline in religion. In many ways, love is a redirection of emotional energy. We can discuss this. Redirection of emotional energy from up here to down there, with huge pressures, of course. By the time you're calling the person you're sharing a space with angel, there could be some tensions. The great thing about the Christian era is it understood the fervor, the longing for an ideal being, but it very handily situated them up there, and they do not mingle with us here. But Romanticism firmly reverses the levitation, puts the divine in the middle of everybody, and tells everybody that there is such a thing as a soulmate. It's a fascinating concept, but it really gathers speed at the end of the 18th and early 19th century. The idea that there's one person there who can understand you at unusual depth. All sorts of things go with this. The soulmate will understand you without needing to speak. This is a real romantic prejudice that language gets in the way of emotion, a classic romantic division. By the way, romanticism is a slightly dirty word for me, as you'll see. I mean, every time the word is mentioned, every time people say something is not romantic, that's generally a really good idea. People say, a couple went out on a date and they discussed their finances. Not very romantic. And you think, yeah, it is. I mean, in terms of if we use romantic as conducive actually to the success of a relationship, or if you pour water on the idea that someone met after 2 weeks and married in Vegas, and you go, I'm not sure that's such a good idea. Oh, that's not very romantic of you. Well, it's a good thing. Anyway, so they don't have a soulmate. They understand you without words. Music, of course, the great romantic medium of communication, and so it's this whole idea that you will say of a lover, they understood me without me needing to speak, and then you know that it's the right person. You're drawn by mysterious force. You just knew it had to be them. That force is beyond analysis. You can't probe it, etc. Other romantic tropes and ideas. No one has a job. Generally in romantic culture, love, it just subsumes everything. So no one's really working. There's no money. Money is totally off the stage. There's no, think of Jane Austen, the last great English pre-romantic writer. She's obsessed by money. I mean, everybody, she's literally sort of tabulating who earns what, when, how. And it's really important to her definition of love. Like you come with your accounting book to Jane Austen. after that, completely, I mean, Keats, God knows what's happening with the money. It's just whatever. It's also, of course, forever. Love, it has no other end other than death. And then the Romantics are also obsessed by the idea of an early death. So it is forever, but it's going to be short. So kind of interesting. And, quite soon someone develops a cough, tuberculosis, you know the story. So then sex, very particular take and romanticism on sex. Adultery had always been a problem, Medea, etc. There's always some heat around that, but it really becomes a true tragedy in a way that it's not been for a very long time. So sex, the idea of sex outside of love is completely prescribed and is seen as really the end of the world, and that is the romantic idea. Now, many consequences from, we've been wandering around with these romantic ideals for a long time. One of them, I'll come back to the words thing, as we're in a philosophical setting, language, very important. It's led to a massive outbreak of sulking. What is sulking? Sulking is really a consequence of romanticism. I'm telescoping, but it's a consequence of romanticism in the sense that it's something that arises if you believe that your partner must understand, you should understand you. If the proof of true love is wordless understanding, you can have a lot of sulking on your hands, because you're going to get a lot of situations where there's something that you're feeling, like I'm really annoyed at the partner, but you won't explain it to them. And so it's a quintessential romantic moment. You sit there with your arms crossed, your partner goes, is anything wrong? You go, and they go, must be something wrong. No, like this. And it goes on and on. You lock yourself in the bathroom, they're begging you, etc. And you don't want to come out and you don't want to say it. And if they're saying, why? And really, the real answer is, because I was brought up as a romantic child, and I believe that true love means that you should be able to see through the outer skin into my soul and read my soul, as Keats suggested. And if not, then, anyway. So on and on it goes. Also, a belief in no secrets. Romantics very obsessed by the idea that there cannot be a secret. If you have something that a truth in you, it belongs also to the other. And a beautiful idea until you're having breakfast a Saturday morning. It's great. You're eating your eggs, avocado, and you say, "Oh, the waiter's quite fine," and and then massive argument because you don't want to hear that side from your partner. The true complexity of a human being. It's hard to fully be yourself with another person. We can discuss whether, again, a great romantic idea. This person allowed me to be fully myself. Really? Is that a good idea? All areas. Also, a terrible view of criticism. Again, people will break up and they'll go, someone will go, why did you break up? No, my partner was too critical. They just didn't allow me to fully be myself. And you want to say, okay, so Plato, for example, views love as a classroom. The ancient Greeks saw love as a classroom in which two people, under a benevolent and generous spirit, are trying to induct one another to become the best versions of themselves. This sounds hugely odd. If you said to your partner, look, I've read some Plato, love is a classroom, and that's why I'm going to point out certain things that you're doing, when it's sort of immediately, it's a fine line between an insult. And of course, because of this, we don't learn a very subtle art, which is a pre-modern art, which is diplomacy. Diplomacy is it's not just what Peter Mandelson used to do. It's something that everyone is called to do in order to have a good life, which is to try and get difficult information across to another person. And again, the Romantics are not thinking too much about this, because the truth is always supposed to be its own reward. Well, and this, of course, psychotherapy is very aware of this. If you tell people things about themselves, they may be very true, but you will come up against what they call defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are there to protect you against the full glare of uncomfortable truths, which may nevertheless be really necessary. So part of being a successful lover is not just having the truth and spitting it out, but also finding the right moment, finding the time, finding the best possible way in which the truth can make its way from one mind into another. This is something, it's also something that philosophy has wrestled with. When I started my career in philosophy, I remember being utterly struck by the differences in which philosophers would write. Some papers, very charming, incredibly easy to read, etc. Other papers, impenetrable, etc. And I remember saying to teachers, professors, saying, there's a real difference between these two. And they would go, yes, well, one's more intelligent or less intelligent, but it had nothing to do with the presentational manner, because at least in those days, philosophy was not understood to be a medium which should be interested in the seduction of the reader. That's almost close to rhetoric. What matters is the truth, and if the truth is there, it doesn't matter how you write. It's just how it's just the points you're making, not how you're making them. transpose that to love. Again, how do we want to live that issue in love? And I become a firm believer that you may have all sorts of insights into your lover, all sorts of things you need to share, etc. Unless you're doing it in the diplomatic way, forget it. And that means at the right time. There's no point broaching an enormous topic at 1 a.m. when someone's had a drink. No one's ever learned anything under conditions of humiliation. By the time you've told someone a threat or told them that they're not as good as their mother or something, you've lost them. So how you get it across is really, really important. The other thing, of course, that we've learned, and a major insight, so the age of Romanticism starts to bleed, of course, into the age of therapy. So 1900, interpretation of dreams. We are still, I believe, living in an age which has blended the romantic and the therapeutic. I'm firmly on the side of the therapeutic, I should say, but very keenly aware of the romantic. You see this issue in its sharpest form when it comes to how people are when they go on a date. So you set people up on a date and you wait to hear what's happened, and they go off and meet. And then you call them up after the date and you go, how did you get on with this person that I helped you to meet? They seemed really good on paper. And often the person says, yeah, no, on paper, yeah, no, great, nice, thank you so much. They were really, really nice person, really nice evening. You go, what was really going on? I don't know. Yeah, something. I don't know. And you're thinking, what is it that's not right? And then you get this, difference between the paper and the psychology. On paper, this should work. Psychologically, it doesn't. Why does it not work psychologically? Well, this is an enormous topic that psychotherapy has lifted the lid on. And essentially, psychotherapy gives us a fascinating story, which is it tells us that the way in which we love as adults is following in grooves defined in childhood. And that love is always a question of refinding love. But there's a real but in it. The priority in adult love is to seek familiarity, not fulfillment. So we will prioritize familiarity. So if your father has been an alcoholic and your mother has been depressed, these are not great things when you're a child, but they feel really familiar, really kind of, yeah, you're there. So when you go out on the dating scene, you meet lots of people who might be really great on paper. There are lots of people who don't drink, lots of people who are not depressed, but yeah. Kind of get ahead off to things that feel a little bit familiar. We're laughing. It's absolutely tragic, and it happens. I am a qualified therapist. I did a therapy training, and I now see clients. And this theory, which was a theory floating on high, you see it every day, and it's galling and it's humbling. And we can only fall on our knees and pray to the God of philosophy at how stricken we are as human beings. We're really stricken in this area. So, your friend who you set up on a date, really, if they were being honest, saying, why didn't you want to get together with this person? Really want to say something like, look, thank you for setting me up with this person, but I just didn't sense that they would make me suffer in the way that I feel I need to suffer in order to feel I'm in love because of my childhood. That's the long answer, which you tend not to say. So you just go, I didn't fancy them. But that's often what's really going on. Again, back to psychotherapy, most of the crazy, distorted things that people are doing as adults has its root, obviously, in patterns learned in childhood. And the poignant thing, this is, again, what you learn, is that in order to survive childhoods, we learn all sorts of quite clever tricks, like, for example, disassociating. Fantastic. If there's violence in the house and you're 5 years old, you learn to disassociate. You learn to split your mind from your circumstances. Fantastic. You go off into another world. That's really useful, age 5. Fantastic. If you've got a very depressed parent and you're 7, what might you do? Really focus on the upside and become a joker. Constant jokes, levity. You just stay on the surface because you're going to need to carry somebody. If somebody's very judgmental in your family, you might be extremely keen to just please everybody. Yes, absolutely, great idea, fantastic, I'll do that, absolutely, etc. Just trying to keep the peace, and on it goes. These things which children work out intuitively, it's unbelievable genius how they work it out. It's their survival strategy, becomes, of course, age 30, 40, 50, an unbelievable liability. What worked brilliantly and had an absolute logic to it, age 5, no longer works. And this is when people are so unsympathetic to the craziness that we're all up to. People go, why is that person why is that person invulnerable? Why can't they open up in love? You want to go, do you know the childhood that this person came through? Of course it made no sense to open up in love. They would have been annihilated. So no wonder that they've gone through 3 marriages and no one knows what they're feeling inside, because that's how they learned to be. That was their survival strategy. Or why is that person so superficial and slick and you can't raise any melancholic topic with them? Well, that's how they survived. Sometimes some of us have to become comics in order to survive our child. Some of us have to get on stages and make a lot of fuss and whatever. This is not normal, isn't it? I mean, this is very strange, very, very strange. I mean, if your definition of good parenting, your child has no inclination to be famous, you've done well. Otherwise, something's gone wrong. So, by the way, I mean, look, in love, no one needs a completely sane person. And if you look for a sane person, you'll never find them. The best thing you can do in love is to find somebody who has some kind of grasp on the map of their distortions and insanity. That's the best we can do. And, standard question on an early dinner date should just be, how are you crazy? And if the person gets offended and runs away, it's a bad sign, because, it's they should be relatively relaxed and have something to say. So if they don't speak, leave immediately. So, and by the way, I mean, all mental illness, I want to say, we could have debates about this. All mental illness ultimately has to do with a shortfall of love. Everybody who's in an institution, everybody who's struggling with their mental health, etc., it can all be traced very crudely with a marker pen to incidents in childhood when there was a deficiency of love. Love literally helps to heal the mind. All those maneuvers of mind that we associate with health are essentially the gifts of love. So, for example, a lack of paranoia. Paranoia is a standard part of mental unwellness. The sense where you can't really separate what's coming at you and targeting you from what is a more random accident in the world. You can't, that distinction slips constantly. And therefore you just don't, you think something is against you that isn't. This is, to be protected from this is again a gift of love, because you start through a loving education, through a loving early journey. You're protected from a sense that you may be the center of everything that goes wrong. I mean, by the way, this is extremely depressing news. I mean, the idea, I'm really harking to this standard psychotherapeutic view, which is it's all in your childhood. And it's so boring. I mean, we have a YouTube channel at the School of Life, which I help to run, and every film is about your childhood. And there's someone who every week takes upon themselves, we launch film at 2:00, and at 2:15, they're there, and they go, another film about childhood from the School of Life, and they have lots of exclamation marks, and it's always the same person, and they're just having fun doing this. And I always go in and I go, yes, you're right, sadly it is. And we just have this back and forth every week. And sadly, it's true. I mean, I share the person's frustration. It's maddening. You're 40, you're 50, you're 60, and it really is supposed to be between 0 and 10. How is it even logical? I sometimes help people to understand it by talking about language. When we're 2, 3, 4, we're acquiring a language, a grammatical language. Hundreds of words, thousands of constructions, declensions, etc., are entering our minds as we're doing other stuff. We're doing handstands in the garden, drawing buttercups in the kitchen, and yet it's all going in. And so that by 5, we have a language bedded in. And that language will remain with us throughout our lives. And if you try and learn another language in middle age, I mean, boy, even with Duolingo, you've got your work cut out. It's very, very hard. You will never really reach fluency very, very, very easily. Something similar, you're learning an emotional language. Of course you are. You're learning a grammar not of words, but you're learning a grammar around value. What are you worth? What is your worth as a human being?
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.